Hi, I'm Lisa O'Brien, and you're watching a podcast where nostalgia comes alive. It's Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show. Roll it.
Welcome to Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show, where nostalgia comes alive. Join Jake and his friends on a journey through pop culture of the past, where they interview professionals in the worlds of acting, directing, writing, puppeteering, and so much more. Who will they be chatting with today? Find out in this Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show, the podcast where nostalgia comes alive. Happy to be here with us, folks. Thank you for joining, as always. Of course, I'm your host, Jake Mute. Of course, our co-host, Chris Bixby. How's it going, my friend?
Doing good, doing good. Hello, everybody. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing great, as always, Chris. Thank you for asking. What a fun interview that y'all were about to witness momentarily. Such a wonderful creative duo that done so much throughout the industry of television, from various children's shows to into other kind of little older shows, but kind of that in the kind of formats that I'm sure most of you will be tuning in. Will definitely know from their work in certain shows. I'm sure probably some of you might definitely got to watch growing up, especially to you, wonderful Chris here. Yeah, it's a lot of fun getting to chat with those two wonderful guests. It's been a while since we had like two guests on, so it's cool to have another episode kind of like that. So yeah, I don't want to waste any more yapping from me. Chris, what do we have for today?
Today we had the pleasure of speaking with two animation legends, Paul Germain and Joe Ansolabehere, known simply in their credits as Paul and Joe. We talk a lot about their animation career from their early days working on Rugrats, which Paul also co-created along with Arlene, Klasky, and Gábor Chucpo. And we talk about the shows that Paul and Joe created together, including Recess, Lloyd in Space, and co-developing the 2010 reboot of Pound Puppies that aired on the Hub. We also talk about Joe co-developing Hey Arnold for Nickelodeon with the wonderful Craig Bartlett.
Yeah.
Just a whole bunch of wonderful things. We talk about the characters from all those shows and the inspiration for them, favorite episodes, favorite moments, working with the other writers and directors, voice talent, so on. Let's not waste any more time. We really enjoyed speaking with
Yeah.
them, and
Yes, we
we
did.
know
I'm sure y'all will enjoy our chat with them too.
exactly. So without further ado, enjoy our chat with Paul and Joe.
Yes, exactly. See you then. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show, the podcast where nostalgia comes alive.
Yes, today we're pleased to have with us Paul and Joe, creative team Paul and Joe. How are you both?
Very
Oh,
well.
great.
Yes, delighted to have you here.
Thanks, exactly. Likewise, indeed,
Yeah.
what Chris just said.
Yes, I can tell this is going to be a lot of fun. So,
Yeah.
so to start this off, could you tell our audience a bit about yourselves and what you do?
Paul?
Joe, why don't you
All
start?
right. About ourselves. Let's see. Well, Paul and I met many years ago when we were both in university at UCLA. We were both in film school, and we were both, we were both really interested in film. We had lots of other friends who we were actually closer with. We knew each other pretty well. We worked together in the audio visual services. We were the guys who pushed the carts around that had TVs on them and stuff into different classes. And we knew each other and we were pretty good friends, but we became, through mutual friends after film school, much closer. And what happened is Paul left film school right away. He didn't even finish. He was like, I'm out of here. At one break, he got an internship at a company called James L. Brooks Productions. Was that what it was called at that point?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, and he ended up, his first gig right out of school, so he's like 22 or something like that, was on a movie called Terms of Endearment, if you've ever heard of Terms of Endearment. And it won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and it was a big deal, and it was James L. Brooks's movie. And James L. Brooks then went on to form Gracie Films, which ended up making The Simpsons, but before that made shows like what was the name of that show again? The Tracy Ullman Show. But he also Paul ended up working on tons of movies like Say Anything and all these big movies. And in the meantime, I went off and was writing screenplays with another friend named Steve Vixen. We were having some luck. And I ended up working in the computer animation industry early on, like in a place called Rhythm and Hues, which did special effects films. And one day, the Gracie Films guys were looking for a new credit sequence, and Paul called me, and he was cranked up too, because they really got you guys moving, I think. Paul called up and was like, "Hey, what's going on? I'm looking at Paul Germain over Gracie Films. I'm looking for a new credit sequence. And I'm for the right." And I said, Paul, it's Joe. And he goes, Joe? And it's like, calm down. He's, oh man, these guys got me going over here, man. And so he was looking for a new credit sequence for, was it Tracy Ullman? I guess it was.
It was for Tracy Ullman, yeah.
Yeah. And we ended up starting a friendship again. And then later when Paul got Rugrats off of The Simpsons, basically. I mean, there's a longer story to it, which Paul can explain to you. But he brought me and my friend Steve in, and we started writing on the show. And we ended up, in the first season, we wrote maybe about a third of them or something, and worked on a bunch of other stories with Craig and Paul. And then in the second season, Craig left and Steve left, and it was just me and Paul and a bunch of other guys. There was a guy named Pete Gaffney and John Greenberg, and then eventually Rachel Lipman and Holly Huckins and Mike Ferris. And it was a great group of writers that we were all sort of jammed up in this little corner of Klasky Csupó, where, they were making The Simpsons in one half of the room and Rugrats in the other half, right, Paul? I mean, that's basically it. And we met all these great directors, and it was a really, really creative place and a really creative time. Was that a good overview of it, Paul? Or Paul's got detail.
No, that sums it up.
Guy.
There you go.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's great. So I kind of want to in a way go back to from how you both what was before starting working in animation professionally, what was your childhoods like, and you both were always interested.
Paul, go for it.
In animation growing up in general.
Before, boy, that takes us back a ways. Yeah, before we started growing up, we didn't, of course, know each other. We met at film school in the early '80s. So I'll just speak for myself, and Joe can tell you about his childhood. I grew up in Los Angeles and San Diego, and I loved movies. I was just really, really into movies. I didn't think of it at the time as something I would go into professionally. I just loved going to the movies. Joe and I grew up in the '70s, and we both loved, not knowing each other, living, states apart. We both loved movies in the 1970s when we were kids, and all the cool stuff that was coming out, like The Godfather and, zillions of great movies. And we just both loved going to the movies. And it's something that later on, when we met in film school, and my route and Joe's route getting to film school was very circuitous. We didn't know that's what we were going to do. But, I was studying economics and Joe was studying history. We didn't know we were going to do that. And when we both kind of fell into that, and for different reasons in different ways, it's like we both had the same taste and we both loved the same stuff. Does that kind of sum it up, Joe? Or
Paul was down in San Diego. Paul, I'll give you a little bit. Paul is Jewish, and his family, he has 4 brothers, all brothers, and he's the oldest. And his mom and dad were really powerful people. Would that be a good way of putting it?
I was not powerful there, but yeah, other ones.
Well, they're big. They had big personalities, and I was Catholic. 5 brothers, all brothers, and I was the oldest. And my parents, big personalities, right? And my parents were up from Northern California, and they moved all around the country. We lived in Detroit and Illinois, and ended up in Reno, Nevada. And they kept moving. They were kind of wanderlust kind of people, and so was Paul's parents, but they moved around Southern California a lot. So we had a lot of similar childhoods in a weird way, in very different ways. Different different ideologies that we were raised with, different and then not in some ways. We were the oldest sons of kind of this, you know, kind of not powerful, but an energetic family, let's put it that way. And we learned to express ourselves very loudly, which other people didn't appreciate, right? And we were like, oh, we're not fighting with each other, we're communicating. And people were like, oh, don't get away from them, they're yelling at each other again. And one time, it's funny, one of the other writers had a son he brought to the
I was going to tell this story
the
too.
Rugrats, and Paul and I were talking about some story, and we're yelling in this office, going, "No, that's crazy! You know, you should do it this way." And this little kid came in, and he was probably about 2 years old or 3 years old, maybe 3 years old, and he just looked at us and he turned to his dad and says, "Teenagers too loud," and turned and walked out of the room. And we were like, "Yep, that's us. We're the loud teenagers. We're
the loud teenagers.
Oh man,
teenagers too loud."
Oh
So
my
anyway,
goodness.
Paul and I had this very different, and I think it must be really hard for your generation to understand what it was like before the internet, right? So there was no internet, and people lived the importance of TV, movies, and pop music, for example, that connected the different generations and the different age groups and the different demographics in a weird way, in a very tight way that it's hard for you guys to understand. Like we didn't, there were no algorithms telling you what you should like, right? We all went to the same movies. You could live in Illinois. So, you know, Illinois, Southern California, Reno, Canada, and you all went that weekend to go see Paper Moon or whatever. You know, you went and saw some movie together. And I don't think people thought about it this way. We all read the same magazines, and if you were interested in that kind of stuff, you just had a weird connection. So when we all got to film school from all over the country, the people who had chosen to go to film school or made it to film school somehow, we were all like, we were looking at each other going, "You watched, you know, The Prisoner in 1968 and on TV. Did you remember that episode?" Like we all knew, we had the same reference points. It was very interesting. And we all we may have had disagreements. Somebody might have been a Beatles fan and somebody might have been a Rolling Stones fan or whatever, but we all knew each other's references, which I think your generation, you're in this world, you do have a lot of that, but you also don't have a lot of that. You know what I mean? You guys go into some deep dives into things way deeper than we ever could have gone. And then you don't connect with that other group over there. Do you know what I mean? But you also have a lot of
that makes sense. Yeah.
a different, interesting thing. And so when we got to film school, Paul and I, and not just me and Paul, but there were a bunch of us, our generation, who we just had seen the same movies, or if we hadn't seen the same movies, we knew what the other guy was talking about, and we got really into it. And it was like an intense place and an intense moment. And you could be at USC or UCLA or Cal Arts or wherever, and people had slightly different group. Like some people were into animation, but they all had seen The Godfather and they had all seen Paper Moon. You know what I mean? And we knew their references too, but we were more into this. Do you know what I mean? So it was kind of it was a really intense and cool time to be creative. That's my feeling of it.
That I want to make is both Joe and I, neither of us had ever considered, when we started film school, both about 1980, 81, 82 in there, neither of us had ever considered animation. Neither of us can draw. Neither of us are artists. We both loved movies, and we thought about live action movies.
Oh, okay.
We stumbled into animation in the weirdest ways, which we can tell you a little bit about. And
yeah, sure.
So when we got into animation, we were coming at it from the point of view of people who loved live action movies, not really animation.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
If you think about it, what's interesting, like other people who were on the animation side, they also understood our references. So for example, like Brad Bird started as an animator, right? He started out as an animator. He was working in the same room there with Paul on the early Simpsons episodes, right? And he ends up going from there to Pixar. We knew all those guys, PDI guys, the Pixar guys. We knew them. They were kind of in our world too, and we might not have been friends with them, but it was a big group, and there was not everybody moved back and forth, but there was an ability to work in the other genre a little bit, you know, whereas I think now it's hard. I don't know if it's harder, but like Brad Bird could end up going and directing Mission Impossible, and it didn't seem insane at the time, right? Paul, would
Mhm.
that be a good way to
Yeah.
put it? And the other way around.
Yeah.
And you had people like us who were not animators, but we were storytellers, and we could communicate with the animation directors. There were some people who did not like us being involved, who were purists, like John Chris Falusi made it pretty clear to if you look in, I'm not saying
Yeah.
anything that's, I mean, if he would say, I didn't like those guys. I don't like writers working in animation because I'm a purist. It's all about movement and color and this thing. And we didn't feel that way. I mean, we thought writing was really important, and we saw animation as this medium that was kind of fresh and interesting, and we loved what was happening with The Simpsons. Paul was involved with those early Simpsons, and when Rugrats happened, it was like, let's take that sensibility, let's take that storytelling that's really coming out of live action and move it over into it's moved into animation with The Simpsons. Now let's move it into kids animation with Rugrats. That's kind of what that's an overview version of it. But wouldn't you agree with that, Paul? That's kind of what happened, I think.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool.
So now starting off, talking about Rugrats, starting off with you, Paul, since you were one of the creators, how did you first get connected with Arlene, Klasky, and Gábor Chupo, the other creators?
Well, it's kind of a crazy story. Um, I was working, as Joe mentioned, I was working for Jim Brooks. He'd been in the 1970s, he had been like Brooks had been like the king of television in the 1970s. He did the Mary Tyler Moore Show, like a god in TV. But then just about the time that I started working for him, like a little bit before I started working for him, he made this movie called Terms of Endearment, which won the Academy Award the next year. And he became like a god in movies. So he was like the king of TV and the king of movies at the same time. And for a couple of years there, he just made movies. But then he decided he wanted to get back into television. And he decided he wanted to do a show based on this British comedian, Tracy Ullman. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Tracy Ullman, but she was this British comedian
I
who
think
did
so.
like imitations and voices and acting, stuff like that. You can look her up.
Mhm.
Anyway, so he decided he was going to do this show. It was for the Fox network, which was brand new. It was the first time there was a new network in like 50 years, like even during radio, right? And suddenly there was the Fox network, and he said, he was doing the show for them, and he was going to do this variety show. And he decided as part of the variety show that he was going to do little interstitial cartoons. And I was in this meeting where he kind of announced this, and we're sitting in his big office at the 20th Century Fox lot. And he says, I want to put little interstitial cartoons between these sketches of this show. And somebody said, okay, well, what do you want to do for these cartoons? And he looks around his office and he sees this. He has this cartoon of Life in Hell. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it was this cartoon strip that was in like those weekly independent newspapers in the I don't even know if you guys are familiar with them.
Yeah,
like the
kind of,
LA Weekly, the LA.
yeah,
Interest-
kind of like what Peanuts used to be, right? Like those, like something like that.
Right.
Yeah,
They were more
interesting. Right.
underground than that. They kind of had this underground feel to them.
Hmm.
And I was a huge fan of those cartoons. And someone had given him the original mock-up of one of the cartoons as let's get that guy. And I'm 24 years old, and I jump up and I go, oh, in the middle of this big meeting, because I was just a dumb kid. And I jumped up and I said, oh, I love that stuff. Those are great. And he looked at me and he said, great, you're in charge. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, you're going to have to deliver about a half a minute of animation every week. And I said, but I don't know anything about animation. He said, well, you better learn. And so I got thrown into this thing that I didn't know anything about. Well, to not make the story take too long, we hooked up with Matt Groening, who had done those original cartoons. Originally, 20th Century Fox wanted to buy his Life in Hell strip from him, but they wanted to own part of it, and he didn't want to do that. So they said, give us something else. And so he drew his family. All those characters in
wow.
The Simpsons are his actual family. with their names. Like his dad's name is Homer, his mom's name is Marge. All those
Oh,
were like his
wow.
family. Yeah.
Wow.
So his
That's
sister
crazy.
Lisa, his other Maggie, all that stuff is real. So
Wow.
he kind of designed these characters, and we had to put together these little 1 minute cartoons that would go between the sketches of the show. Now, I don't know anything about animation. I'd never done it before. I knew what it was, but I'm not an artist and I had nothing to do with it. So we sort of made our own little way of making cartoons, which is we would write a little 2-page script, because these were about 30 seconds long. And I'd go and record the actors, and then we'd go and take the tracks, which we edited so that they sounded like little radio shows. You'd laugh at them if you heard them, right? And then we took them to this little company that we found that was kind of cool, this little kind of underground animation company called Klasky Chupó that we found. And we said, okay, here's the soundtrack. Now you animate to this. And they did. And that's basically how The Simpsons were born. But they were these little 1-minute cartoons that were on the Tracy Ullman Show. And then after like a couple of years of these, we built up a library of them.
But you should explain, Paul. It was a husband and wife, Klasky and Csupó. So it was Arlene Klasky and Gábor Csupó. So Paul ended up in this friendship with these
people who had just this little company. And then through
Yeah.
a series of events that happened, it kind of became clear to me that The Simpsons was going to be turned into a series, but instead of having this creative role, because I was very young, I realized I was just going to be like a line person, like a technical producer, doing budgets and things like that, which is not what I was interested in. So I decided I was going to get out of that and do something.
Yeah.
Well, I can kind of continue the story to some extent. He ended up saying, "I want to do something more. I want to be involved with the creative side of things." And he was involved with the very beginning of The Simpsons, but a guy named Sam Simon and a bunch of these big writers came in and they kind of took over this little thing that Paul and Matt had been doing in their room by themselves. So he was thinking even of going off and becoming a teacher. He kind of decided, I'm just going to go be a teacher in Kansas, because his wife was in medical school in Kansas. And just as he was about to leave, Gábor Csupó said to him, "I hear you're leaving. What do you mean you're leaving?" And he said, "Well, I think that this isn't for me." And he says, "Why don't you come over and work for me?" And Paul was like, "Doing what?" And he said, "Doing development." And at that point, in those days, development meant you read a lot of scripts, you dug through a bunch of screenplays, because everybody was writing screenplays, and then you'd pick one out, But that's not what Gábor wanted. He wanted somebody to come up with a new show. Because Gábor believed, and he was right, that because The Simpsons was such a big hit, animation was going to start taking off. And so Paul
Oh, good.
So I got you up to your developing stuff one night, and I said the last thing I said was that Gábor had this idea that animation was going to take off, and he wanted you to develop stuff and not just read scripts. So keep going.
Right. And so I got this job, and I'm working at this little company, and Gábor says, somebody is going to come looking for cartoons from us, and I want to be ready for it. So come up with ideas. So I had all these little ideas. I developed an idea about bugs, like something like what Bugs Life turned out to be a few years later. But
Right.
I had all these different ideas, and I had artwork. We had commissioned some artists to design boards for them. We were going to pitch them. And we were just expecting that someone was going to come along looking for cartoons from us. And they did. It was this little company that I'd never heard of called Nickelodeon, which was this was at the very beginning of like cable. And they wanted, a kids show, and they wanted us to pitch stuff. So we had this big meeting. It was the first time I'd ever pitched anything. And I'm preparing for this pitch and all my little ideas and these art boards that I've got and stuff like that. And then the night before the pitch, Gábor's wife, who was one of the principals in the company, Arlene Klasky, came to me and said, "I have an idea for a show." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "I want to do a show about babies." And I said, "Babies? What about babies?" And she said, "Well, it's animation, right? So maybe the babies could talk. And it could be like, there was a show on at the time called 30 something. And she said, it could be like one something. It could be like what it's like to raise babies and stuff like that. And I thought, okay, I got a baby. They're really cute. I thought, yeah, I do too, but I don't know what to do with that. So I went home thinking, babies, babies, babies. What do I do with that? And I remembered coming home I remember when my youngest brother, Joe told you that we each had, like, we were the oldest of all these boys, right? Well,
Right.
my youngest brother, 8 years younger than me, came home from the hospital. And I remember going into this room. In my memory, there was no one else there. That's probably not true, but that's how I remember it. And I walk in and I look at this little baby, my youngest brother, and I'm 8, he's a newborn. And I look at him in his crib and he can barely lift his head, and he's drooling and his eyes won't focus. And I thought, man, he can't be as stupid as he looks. And I said, I bet he's faking us out. I bet he's just pretending to be like this. I bet he's like a boy like us. And I bet when we leave the room, he's going to jump up and like show that he's really thinking and he's like us. And I just remember this crazy thought. I'm just about to go to sleep and I think,
Getting out of here. I'm busting out of here or something.
yeah. And I thought, oh, that's funny. And I wrote a little note to myself and then I went to sleep, right? The next morning I wake up and I look at this little note and I go, oh, that's pretty funny. And I didn't think another thing of it. So now we go into this pitch and I start, and this lady named Vanessa Coffey's there from Nickelodeon, never met her before. And she goes, okay, guys, show me what you got. So we start to pitch our ideas. I show her the first idea and I've got like 4
Bugs.
painted art boards. What? Bugs. Yeah,
The
bugs.
bug life.
Like a film noir with bugs. And I pitched this idea and she looks at it and she goes, I got 2 pages of write-up and a bunch of artwork. She goes, nah, what else you got? And so she pitches, I pitch her my next idea, but this one I have like 1 page of writing and maybe 2 colored artboards. She don't like that one either. I go to my next idea. Now I've got just black and white drawings and 1 page of notes. She don't like that one either. Now I'm down to my paragraphs with no artwork, and I'm pitching her. She don't like any of it. I'm going and going. She doesn't like any of it. This is how pitches go, by the way, if you guys have ever been on one. And then suddenly we get down to my just 1-line ideas, and I say, okay, a bunch of incognizant little babies, but it turns out when the adults leave the room, the babies talk. They're cognizant and they talk and they have adventures. And she said, I love it. And that was how Rugrats was born.
That's awesome.
And everything came out of that.
That's wonderful.
There you go.
So that's how we got in. That's how I got into animation. And then we started working on the show. We developed this pilot, which you can watch on YouTube. It never got broadcast, but it's very cool and fun. It's done by Peter Chung, who's a really great animation director. And you can get a sense of what we started with. And then we started developing it into a show and figuring out what it would be. And then I called Joe and Steve mainly because I knew Steve's work. I didn't know Joe's work as well in those days. And Steve and Joe came in and worked with us and they pitched shows and Joe and Steve and I just kind of connected. We realized how much we had in common and how much we loved working together. And I learned a ton from them. And the rest is history. So that's sort of how it happened.
Yeah.
There you go.
I remember Paul brought
absolutely.
us in and I was kind of an animation fan because my roommate in UCLA had been an animator and I'd kind of gotten a crash course in it. But I remember watching this thing and Paul was in, and it was just me and Paul and Steve in a conference room. I don't know if you remember this, Paul, and you were showing us the videotape and you kept looking at us like, huh? Do you like it? Huh? And we were like, stop looking at us. But it was funny because I was looking at it, I was like, this is like Eastern, like Polish animation or Czechoslovakian animation. That's what it looked like to me. It was all scratchy lines and stuff. And it was just not Warner Brothers. It was so different than anything else.
Disney.
It wasn't Disney. It wasn't Warner Brothers. It wasn't even The Simpsons. It was something, the original one especially looked very Eastern European. And I think that's because that was Gábor's taste, but also it was interesting because it also had like a combo that with sort of anime animation style. Do you know what I mean? And so it was a very, because of Peter Chung, I think, because he, animated it in that way on doing things on twos that would normally be on whatever, whatever he was doing. And it was just like, so, I don't know, it was just really it was a really special thing to see at that moment because it was like nothing else. And I think
one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted it to be, we were terrified because it's about babies, right? We were terrified of it being cute, right? This is at the time that there were shows on the air like Muppet Babies and stuff like that, and Smurfs, all that cute stuff.
Right.
We didn't want to do any of that. We wanted it to look kind of a little bit grotesque and weird and uneven.
Gritty. It looked like a gritty world, like it was a tough world. And we thought that was, I remember going, wow, that's cool.
Right. So now with characters such as Tommy and Angelica Pickles, there was some personal inspiration behind those characters after doing some research. So Paul, could you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind Tommy and Angelica?
Well, Tommy I had a newborn baby at that time, and his name was Thomas. So we kind of named the character. I kind of named the character after my son, but not. I mean, he was just an infant at this point, so it wasn't like he had a particular personality that I was trying to communicate. It was just sort of my inspiration was that I had a kid. Angelica, on the other hand, was based on, we wanted to have a character who was going to be the villain of the show. Originally, Gábor had shown me a design that he had for what the character that turned out to be Chuckie, and I said, that guy doesn't look like a villain. He looks like a little scaredy.
Oh, wow.
Which is what he turned out to be. But we thought, well, what would be an interesting villain? And I thought, well, what would be different? What have I not seen? I thought, how about a girl villain, right? I hadn't seen that before. And I thought, and then we started talking about, well, what kind of villain would that be? And I remembered, like, when I was 10 years old, that there was this girl that used to pick on me when I was coming home from school. And I thought, oh, that's cool, a girl bully. And then we thought, oh, that's interesting. I've never seen that before. And then a combination of Joe and Steve and Craig Bartlett and we kind of figured out, well, what if she's a little older than the other characters so that she actually can talk to the adults? Because as you remember, part of the thing about Rugrats is that the adults don't know that the babies can talk, and the babies don't understand what the adults are saying. So there's no communication between them except for Angelica, who's a little older. So she can communicate with the adults and
understand both sides and communicate. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And she uses it as a source of power. So she uses it to tell the kids, to give them wrong information and to lie to the adults about what's going on. So she uses it for power. And she became like maybe she became kind of a key character. The two key characters in Rugrats are Angelica and Chuckie. Chuckie's like the heart of the show.
And didn't you tell me, Paul, that Craig named her Angelica? Because Angelica. But Craig has this thing of naming all his characters like Olga and Helga and like all these Nordic names.
Yeah.
They're always like.
We like Angelica because
angel. She's an angel. She
the
comes off
opposite of an angel.
Yeah.
But
her
parents think she's an angel. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Who did the first messing up of the it was at the baseball episode, so it was you guys who did you and Craig wrote that one, the one about messing up the national anthem, because that actually
that's actually later. That the baseball one was not. It was in the first season, but it was late in the first season. It was like
I thought that was when the messing up of language started. Maybe it was earlier than that. It was something that she did. She sang "Happy Birthday" or something. She did something in one of the early episodes where she messed up the lyrics of a song, and I remember people going, "That's interesting if they mess up words," which I think got out of hand. Personally, it
got totally out of control.
I think in the first couple seasons we found it. And I think for before, when we were running it anyway, I felt like we kind of found a place. But like later Rugrats, it's like people would mess up words that 2 minutes ago they got it right. So it's like, wait a minute, they're just messing up words because they think it's funny.
The whole idea of messing up words was initially what Joe was part of this, was that it would be expressions that you've heard kids mispronounce that
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you can see why they, like Paschetti
or a word
or
that
something
was
like
too
that.
big.
Yeah.
Or a word that was too
Exactly.
big, or a word that even you would go, oh, I remember not knowing what that meant, but I could imagine myself doing that. But then it became people messing up just regular nouns and stuff and verbs. And it was like, come on, guys.
There's
And
no
I think
reason.
it lost its humor to me.
Yeah, yeah.
It was
But that
funny.
was later. That was after we'd gone.
Yeah, we had gone, but we used to sit and debate it and say, should we? No, let's not do that, and because people were always trying to overuse it, I think.
Mm.
But I remember the national anthem, and there was a couple of songs she sang that were really funny because, the national anthem is such a famous one for people not knowing what people are saying and what it means. Jose, can you see? Stuff like that.
Yeah, right.
One naked individual under God, that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
stuff.
one naked individual. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. So anyway, but that was I think that's Angelica and Tommy were, but then Chuckie was the other one that came along.
Yeah, Chuckie
Right.
became like
Uh-huh.
the way we came up with Chuckie, and then really it was Joe who ran with Chuckie. But the way we came up with Chuckie was we knew that the key to the show was going to be like a baby who's like an intrepid explorer, like a guy who wants to go out and discover the world. And so we thought, well, if their main character is this explorer, this kind of brave explorer, then his best friend's got to be, you want characters that oppose each other. And so we thought, well, let's have a guy that's terrified of the world, that just wants to hang out in his playpen where it's safe. And so that's how we came up with Chuckie. And then Joe was the one who said, I get this guy. I want to find the heart of this character. And that's
Well,
how
it's funny
Chuckie
because I remember when you guys had a little Bible you did, which we kept adjusting and growing over the first few seasons. But you and I guess it was you and Craig put together that really simple Bible. Excuse me. And I remember taking it home and working with Steve on that. Like we did the barbecue episode was one of the first ones. And I remember we were working on it. And I remember looking at the Bible and saying, there's this one character that I'm really drawn to. And Steve said, I know, me too. This one character I really love. And I was like, yeah, me too. And we thought we were talking about the same character, but I said, yeah, this Chuckie guy is great. And he's like, Chuckie? I love this Angelica kid, and I think Steve loved writing Angelica because he just loved her sweetness and meanness at the same time. And I think
Yeah.
I love Chuckie because he was completely innocent, but also because he was kind of smarter than he knew. You know what I mean? He was kind of like, he actually knew a bit more than the other kids because he was a little older,
Right.
but he thought he didn't. And I just thought that was such a cool guy. And it kind of reminded
also
me.
he was braver than you
And
made
he was
him
braver
like
than
braver.
he knew.
Yeah.
He's kind of like the cowardly lion or something, or combo. But also, I think because my brother, I had a really tight relationship with a younger brother who was the next brother, and I always felt like in some ways he was the older brother, like he was braver than me and more adventurous than me. And I was like, oh, I don't know. So this whole thing, which Pete Gaffney used to make fun of us all the time, he'd go, I don't know, Chuckie. It's like, I don't know, Tommy. I don't think we should do that. Pete Gaffney would always go, here you go, Joe. But it became very quickly within the first season, this group of writers became very cool to work with. And we found this young guy, John Greenberg, who ended up being able to jump between all our styles. But Pete Gaffney ended up getting brought in. Craig left after the first season, right, Paul? And then that's when we kind of created more of a writing team because in the first season it was all freelance. And then you guys brought me and Steve in to develop Duckman and do some other things, working at the same time on that, right? And then we got to be there. So we were like unofficially staff members with you and Craig, and you guys would say, can you rewrite that? And we would do that. But really it was you two. And then in the second season, so after the first 13, when Craig left, then you and I really sat down and said, let's make this a writing room, like a really old traditional, the Dick Van Dyke Show or something. And that's when I think the scripts got a lot better because we all really focused, and I don't know. And then we also got relationships with the directors, which was really cool. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's how I saw it anyway.
It kind of gelled. Everything kind of came together in the second season. And the second and third seasons are where Rugrats really becomes what people think of it as.
And also, I think the
Right.
directing got better too, with like Norton really stepping up, and all the we had tons of great directors. It was amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. So now this may be a little bit of a tough question, but from your time working on Rugrats, do each of you have a favorite episode that you got to write for Rugrats?
To write, well,
Joe,
Paul, what's that?
you go ahead. I want to hear what you say.
Well, look, I mean, I have things that were more like it's a very weird thing. I have things that were important to me, and so I don't know if that's why they're good or if they weren't good. But like in the first season, for me, a big shift was like I think in the first half of the first season, let's say, actually all the way through the first season, we kept going back to this. Was we kind of came to a formula, let's say, which was the babies go here and wreak havoc, and we called them wreak havoc episodes. And they were kind of invented from the very beginning, even with our like barbecue episode, that very first one. We came in and pitched, Steve and I came in and pitched and said, look, to us, what's cool about this is that since they're little babies, going across a backyard is like Lawrence going to, Lawrence of Arabia or something. It's like, oh my God, look, we're gonna have to get to Aqaba. So we did that barbecue episode where they have to get through and then a dog attacks them and everything. That's like the second episode, right? And Craig and Steve and Gábor, I remember going, that's it. And we were like, really? That's it? We were surprised. But but then it became like that. And then you guys did the baseball episode, I remember. And there were a whole bunch of episodes going to the movies where they would go someplace normal, kind of normal, and cause trouble, basically, out of a misunderstanding, usually, of what was going on, right? Would you say that was kind of the formula? And then Paul kept pushing us in the first season to try these quirkier ideas because I don't know if Paul sees himself this way. I don't think he does, but Paul has a tendency to want to push towards more underground experimental stuff, or at least that's how it felt at the time, and try weirder ideas. And so he had this one called Realer Robots, which he just had a title, and his whole idea was the babies will think they'll think their dad's a robot. I think that was the whole idea, and we were like, what?
Well, no, initially what we thought was what the idea that I had was that thought you had when you were a kid that maybe the whole world is an experiment and everything in it is fake except you, and it's
Right,
all a
yeah.
test. Like maybe
And so Steve and I were like going, what? And Paul kept saying, how about that idea? How about that idea? And we were like, what the hell are we going to do with that? And then Steve and I went home and we worked on it and worked on it. And we were actually I was lying on the floor in my room, I remember, and talking on the phone with Steve. And we're like, what are we going to do? How does this relate to being these characters as children? And what's the universal story? I think that's what we started asking ourselves. And we all started asking ourselves, like, what is the universal story of growing up? And I had a bad experience with my dad once where he lost his temper and spanked me because I kept bugging him
Oh,
in his room. He always
No.
felt guilty. He always said, I always feel bad about it. But I kept getting up in the middle of the night and bugging him because I was scared of a monster in the closet or something. And I pitched it to Steve, and Steve said, what if they keep going in the room and they actually make the dad almost act like a robot? And I was like, ooh, that's funny. And they get chased around thinking their dad's a robot because he's sleepwalking. We're like, ooh, ooh. And we just thought, okay, that weirdly seems like the kind of memory some kid might have. So we started going, oh, what? So anyway, that episode was a turning point for me, even though when I watch it now, I always feel like it's not as good as I remember it, but it was such a turning point
Right.
because it made us start thinking in terms of, I think as we went into the second season, what are like universal kid things, Um,
Right.
and I think that was a big thing for me. And it was more like it led to other things like Chuckie versus the Potty, which was the one I did, and some other things in the second season. And the one that I really liked at the end of it all, for me anyway, because I think I left around episode 50 or something, was one I wrote because a director, you start going, what other ideas can we have? And some director said to me,
that, as Joe mentioned, we kind of were falling back in the first season on these episodes where the kids would go someplace and wreak havoc. And we were doing that over and over with a couple of exceptions. And as we got to the end of the season, we began to realize these characters have really taken on personalities of their own. They're really becoming characters. And
that's true.
Joe and I sat down at the end of the first season and said, we got to break out of this formula. We got to stop doing just episodes where the kids go someplace and wreak havoc. It was getting dumb, and we thought there's a richer vein here that we haven't figured out. And Joe and I sat down and we came up with a bunch of different ideas for types of shows. Like one would be fantasy. There would be a fantasy episode, like the kids imagine they're pirates, right? Or there would be an episode where Tommy and Chuckie would get into some conflict with Angelica, so we'd do something about that. Or maybe we'd put two characters together who weren't normally together, like Angelica and Chuckie end up handcuffed together. That's one we did. Or we said, what if we do, or what would be an episode that's specifically about Chuckie and his problems, or specifically about Angelica and her problems? And so by the time we get to the second season, the show is much richer, and you never know what you're going to get. When you tune in, you might get one episode that's about Tommy and another one that's a fantasy and another one about Chuckie and Angelica. And it was just varied and much more interesting for me. And that's where Joe and Steve really took off and started making episodes like Chuckie versus the Potty.
You had wanted to do an episode about a trial, of some sort of trial. And I can't remember what it was originally. It had something to do with
I wanted to do Rashomon.
Right. You wanted to, right. That's right. Paul wanted to do Rashomon because, again, he had all these really crazy ideas where every different point of view would, and we were like, how are we going to do this? And somehow together, it was like this really interesting moment. We all sat down together, and it was Craig. Craig was there, but I think he was busy with other things. It was me, Steve, and you. So it was like the film school buddies sitting down and saying, how could we do this? And we came up with this parody of Perry Mason, essentially, of like these courtroom dramas that had been on TV when we were kids. Again, it's that connection that we all knew the same reference. And so we made this parody that was really funny. And Paul wrote this hilarious script. We all helped him, but it was Paul's baby. And then he directed it, and it was just it was nonstop. The dialogue was rapid fire. And it was really funny. And it's a trial. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. It's about, whether or not who broke Angelica's clown lamp or whatever it was.
Tommy's clown lamp. Somebody broke it. Who did it?
And it was really funny. And we thought there are these genres kind of Rugrats that we should mix up. And one of them was parody. So that's when we're doing a parody of pirate movies. We're doing a parody of, and then these genres started to overlap with each other. So then it became like we had one called emotional or something, or character emotion or something, where we'd explore something new about the character that you never knew, or they asked themselves a question that they never knew about themselves. And then it became like things like, how could we deal with each character? How could we deal with Phil and Lil? They were the hardest because they were kind of Phil and Lil were kind of the peanut gallery, but Peter Gaffney and John Greenberg both had a connection to Phil and Lil. Peter Gaffney, because he just liked people who were funny, who sat on the sidelines and made cracks about everything, and he came up with a bunch of stories. But also John Greenberg had been a twin, or is a twin. And so he wrote these great stories, a couple of really good stories about like them being separated and going, oh my God, we have to be together, and how you could the boy and the girl would play each other's roles. And it was really funny stuff. And then what happened is we started saying, can we combine these? But we still wanted to do these They Go Here and Wreak Havoc episodes. So we had that as a genre too. And then we thought, like, how can we make some of these Wreak Havoc episodes a little more emotional? Like, how can we do that? And so we started doing, like, Mike Ferris wrote that one where they go to the beach, which is one of my favorite episodes, where at the very end, Chuckie, they've taken all the sea monkeys and dumped them into the what do you call it? Into the cooler, into the ice cooler, thinking they're still alive. And he has an image of the sea monkeys as the sea monkeys on the box, where they're like a king and a queen and babies and stuff. And at the end, they finally dump the cooler into the ocean, and the parents have no idea what they're doing, right? And they don't know. And then at the end, there's this tearful goodbye of him saying, "Goodbye, Lefty. Goodbye, Spike," and he's named all the sea monkeys. And I find it really emotional and touching. And it's weird. I'm like going, oh my God, I'm actually kind of getting choked up. And So it was just like, I remember I remember reading the script with Mike Ferris's like so long, lefty. I remember him saying lefty for one of the sea monkeys and thinking that's so Mike Ferris. But then we got also like towards the end, these weirder ideas got really interesting to me. Like I was saying about the one about the, um, where they're doing slideshows. I think they call it the slideshow, where they've taken their dad's report
Yeah.
or
Hmm.
they've taken the report and they're going through each other. And that was from a director. He said, I want to go to kids and ask them to draw what these characters look like and then use their drawings. And I was like, oh my God. And then the last one we did was Tommy's version, where he just draws, this is me. And it's like, this is me. The idea of a character saying, this is how I see myself. And it's just a draw. It's just a, like what a 1-year-old would do would be like, just put a dot. And then he says, this is you, Chuckie. And there's a bigger circle. And Chuckie says, that's me. And he goes, but I'm bigger than you, Tommy. And I still get choked up thinking about it because it reminds me of my relationship with my brother, but also you and me, Paul. And it's like, I'm bigger than you. He says, well, you are bigger. You're older than me. And and he goes, I am. Gee, it's like this realization. And I find it very emotional, even now, watching that not stupid, but that weird little episode that came at the end. And then it grew and grew and grew and continued. And I ended up leaving the show around this point for the last 13. I think I wasn't there for the first 65. And Paul and John and Rachel Lippman at that point, especially, and I think Peter Gaffney really pushed it to a whole new level with the parody, for example, by going in and doing, the Passover episode, which I think is probably one of the most watched things Nickelodeon has ever done, which is
Oh yeah.
where they basically did Paul, you tell the story, Paul. That's like
Well, what happened was we had done a Christmas episode. I think you were involved in the Christmas episode, Joe, as I recall. But anyway,
I don't remember.
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was a Christmas episode, and it went really well. And Nickelodeon came to us and said, well, now last year you did a Christmas episode. We'd like you to do a Hanukkah episode. And John Greenberg said to me, Hanukkah is not much of a holiday. I don't want to do a Hanukkah episode. Let's do a Passover episode. And I said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Passover, if you're Jewish, that Passover is the really important holiday, right? So we did a Passover holiday, and basically what we were doing in a weird way is like talking about what it's like, what Seders are really like, what it's like to go to a Passover dinner and how that works. And also we were parodying what's it called? So
the Charlton Heston movie, The Ten Commandments, because again, all the references of our generation, we knew those. All of us had seen the Ten Commandments on TV every Easter or whatever, like, yeah, here he comes again. Here comes Charlton Heston splitting the sea. Go for it. Or whatever, and so it was like, it totally made sense for us, but it came out and we had Angelica, Tommy saying, let my babies go or something like that.
Go.
Yeah, and stuff like that. And it just was like, it really hit a chord. I feel like that episode, more than anything, said what Rugrats was to most people, because it had everything. It had character. It had the disconnection between the adults and the kids. It was family. It had parody. It
has Angelica as Pharaoh.
Angelica as Pharaoh. It had Tommy being heroic. It had Chuckie saying, I don't know, Tommy. It had all the things kind of came together in that one episode, which I think was a high point personally. Anyway, but that's around the time we all took off after that.
Yeah, so that was
Right.
basically, it was right after that the show had reached 60. Back in those days, everything was about getting to 65 half hours, which meant that you could syndicate the show. This is like, you guys probably don't even know what syndication is. It was how, those, I don't know if you guys remember, but when we were kids, you would come home every day from school and they would show old shows at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You'd see all these old shows.
Right.
And
Okay.
and that's where the real money was for the producers. And people were still thinking that way in the early 90s when this happened. And so basically we hit 65 half hours. And Nickelodeon said, okay, we got 65 half hours. We don't need to go any further. And so the show ended and we all went in different directions. And then, so that's like 1992, 93 in there. And then right after that, Nickelodeon decided to show Rugrats in prime time, which they hadn't done before. Nickelodeon really wasn't playing in prime time. but they put
It was about 2
Nickelodeon.
years. I think it was about 2 years later because you and I were on.
Right. It was about
I was
95,
on Hey Arnold when
96.
that-
That's
yeah.
right. Joe's right.
Right,
And so they
okay.
put it in prime time, and then suddenly Rugrats took off again, right? It had been a successful show, but now it was really successful. And so
for one
Nickelodeon
reason, it was
decided-
because, one thing we haven't talked about, and part of the reason was we always wanted to make a show that because we all had kids, all of us. When Arlene started this, she said, I want to do something. She wouldn't hire originally. She said, I'm only hiring people who have children, who have babies, right? Wasn't that the thing? Which is how I got the job. I said, how about if you hire Steve? And Paul said, I can't hire Steve. He doesn't have a baby. I said, I got a baby. And he's like, okay, we'll hire you guys as a team, because it had to have a baby. But,
Right.
but what was interesting about that, because of that, is at least me, Craig, Paul, and Arlene were all thinking we want to write a show that you would sit down with and could watch with your kids, because most of the shows you couldn't. You just go, oh my God, this is mind-numbingly dull, But we wanted to watch. So half the jokes, and Steve loved that, for example, and Pete too, because they were writing on a different level. So if you think of, for example, if you ask Pete Gaffney, for example, what his favorite episode, he'd probably pick Reptar and Ice, which is a joke. Clearly, like the kids are like, we don't understand these jokes, but they think it's funny, but it's written on this other level. The songs are like parodies of Broadway musicals and crazy, jokes about, dinosaur, ancient enemy of man, which no kid is going to get that joke, but every adult was like, hilarious. And then Steve, he was writing Angelica, doing parodies of things like when Angelica breaks a leg, or when she goes up with her to her little car when she's going to run away and she's got the little clicker and go dee 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 dee, jokes that for the adults really. And so anyway, just setting it up. So that's why I think when it went into prime time, these people who had never watched it, because adults started watching it with their kids because they're at home making dinner for their kid. And all of a sudden the kids wants to watch the show and they're putting it on. And then all of a sudden they're looking, going, what is this? And they're walking in and they'd never seen it. And it took off.
Pretty good.
It became a massive hit. It had been a big hit. We'd won Emmys. We'd done all this stuff, but it became gigantic after that, like 90.
But by that time, Joe and I had moved on to working on Recess, and we couldn't come back on the show. So the show, it was a whole other group of writers who came on to work with it.
That's when Eric Casimiro came in and all those guys.
Yeah, Eric. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
And
so they
Joe
working
and
on
I,
a show that we had left 3 years earlier. We hadn't anything to do with it, So like I've worked.
The show changed. It wasn't the same show after that.
Yeah, not to us, but we're kind of purists,
right?
So we looked at it. I was like, no, they've done it all wrong. But it continued to be. I think they made another 200 episodes or something like that. It's a crazy number of episodes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's cool to have that show like Rugrats where it's where adults and kids can watch together.
Oh,
jokes, it's a great thing for kind of Nickelodeon back in that time to have that show like that. Of course, since we've been talking a lot, with Angelica, and of course, amazing Cheryl Chase voicing Angelica. Like, oh my goodness, she did such a great job. Also, another previous guest, but she's, she's wonderful. Such talented.
Oh yeah, definitely. And we had the cast that Paul put together. I mean, the thing that was happening.
Yeah, definitely.
It was incredible. I mean, not just Cheryl, but I'm forgetting all the names. But who were the rest of the people?
Well, Tommy was played by E.G. Daly.
Yeah.
Chuckie was played by Chris Kavanaugh, who unfortunately died a few years ago. She was an amazing actress, really amazing.
And Nancy Cartwright, Tara.
Nancy and Tara was never involved in the show. Nancy had a guest appearance in one episode, but she was not on the cast.
I think they might have come in like after the both of you left, because I think.
Yeah, well, what happened was Chris Kavanaugh died, and so they needed to replace Chuckie, and so maybe.
I think they brought in. I think but I think what happened. Chris Kavanaugh, who is an unsung and forgotten person now, she was unbelievably good. Like her timing was unbelievably good, wouldn't you say? I mean, she was just
Oh, she was
incredible.
stunning, and
What
she
happened
captured
yeah.
the emotional side of Chuckie in this really brilliant way. She was
What happened
completely
was
unreachable.
Paul came out of working in TV with Jim Brooks, and Jim Brooks could do whatever he wanted. And so Paul had this idea, and he held on to it through a lot of shows, and it was very difficult for a lot of other TV shows, of having all the actors in the room as much as you can at the same time. And even the actors don't want to do this because this is an easy gig. They can come in, they can read the script over a couple times, get out in a couple hours. But Paul was saying, I want you to rehearse. I want this to be a performance. I want you to play off of each other. Sometimes I want you to talk over each other in certain scenes. And, and it was very, now somebody like, and eventually they all kind of got into it. But you had,
Right.
so you had sort of these two different separate casts who would come in. And so you had these women who were playing these babies who were really funny and brought in all sorts of different things. And Cheryl brought in that Angelica energy, but Christine, I felt like, really pulled everybody together. And then she went on to do the voice of Babe. She became kind of a big deal. And then she had some mental health issues and died very, very young. It's a very sad story. She's a really interesting person to dig into. But then at the same time, Paul had this other cast of characters he was working with, which was the adult world. And what was fun about
they never communicated, so they were never in the recording booth.
They would come in separately. And so Paul there was kind of using all these comedians. He didn't have to worry about, does it sound like a baby? Like it was hard to cast the babies, I think, because you had to say, does it sound like, what's her name, who played Phil and Lil, was amazing. She can play any voice, she can just jump around.
Right,
But
yeah.
most people couldn't. But so Paul had this, when he was putting together his cast for the adults, he'd come in and say, well, he had Jack
Riley,
who Paul was a fan of his. He had watched the old Newhart show.
Newhart show.
Riley, and what was the rest of your cast, Paul? Because you had this amazing cast of people, and they were all people you had been fans of as a
funny.
TV
I'm having trouble with the names. I'm getting old, so I have trouble.
Yeah, it's a long time ago. We're old folks.
But there was Bosley. What's his name, Joe?
Yeah, Tom Bosley.
Not
Tom Bosley.
Bosley.
No. I'll look him up. But do you guys have the names there?
Well, I know because you mentioned Phil and Lil. They
That was Kath Soucie.
And she's incredible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Also, she played Phil and Lil, and she played one of the adults. She was the only one that did. She played Betty. So that was Kath.
Yes.
And then there was Jack Riley, who we mentioned.
Michael Bell.
Oh yeah, Michael Bell. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Michael.
I was going to say him.
Might love him. He's also a previous guest.
Played Howard.
Awesome. Yeah, he's great.
Melanie Chardoff. She was the woman.
And he also played the
mom.
grandfather. And
what
is her name?
I was going to say Melanie Chardoff. David Doyle.
Melanie Chardoff. David
Doyle had played. The reason you called him Bosley is David Doyle had played Bosley, the character Bosley in Charlie's Angels. On the Charlie's Angels TV. But these are all Phil Proctor, who was the guy you kept bringing in.
Yeah, Phil. Yeah, he's great. Yeah, he's wonderful.
You loved Fire Sign Theater, and you were like, I'm going to bring in Phil Proctor because I loved him, And so Paul would just bring in, and then it would be like, and then it was like, hey, let's see if we can get
people that I just loved their voices,
Yeah. And it was kind of like this amazing thing where, all these incredible actors. Yeah, all these incredible actors came in and they would just play bit parts. And it was fantastic. And then at the same time, every week I'd go over and Mark Mothersbaugh would come up to the office to talk with Paul about music, or Paul go to Mark. I'm like, Mark, and Paul's like, well, because Gábor was such a big music fan that Gábor would say, hey, I got an idea. Everybody does Gábor, by the way. Everybody does this. Anybody who's ever worked for Gábor does an impersonation of Gábor, poor guy. But he was this great music fan, and he he just mentioned, hey, why don't we get the guy who's Devo? And Paul's like, Devo, really? You think we can get him? He goes, oh, we can get anybody. And he had balls. He would just and reach out and get these guys. And so Mark Mothersbaugh would be doing all this stuff. And then we met the guy who is his assistant guy who actually did tons of work. We've worked with him for years. And so it's just been, great. It was an amazing experience. It was incredible.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Rugrats, such a wonderful franchise indeed. So since we've now been talking a lot with Rugrats now. So I ask that to you, Joe. So of course for Nickelodeon, of course you got to co-developed Hey Arnold. So now can you kind of describe how you kind of first got involved with the whole process? What was how it all came to be, what was it like, as well, getting to work with Craig Bartlett.
Well, Paul was there too, actually. So what happened was
at
that
the beginning, I wasn't really involved in that.
well, for the thing. So Craig was like the story editor with Paul's number 2 guy in the first 13, right? And and so Craig was doing everything, and Steve and I had come in because Paul kind of quickly realized he didn't have the budget for it, but he needed more writers in the room. So he brought me and Steve in, and they used the budget for development to have us there and blah, blah, blah. So it was like we were the main team in that first season. And Pete Gaffney was one of the main writers, and we brought him in, and it grew. But Craig at the end of the first season left because he was he had other things. He had another gig and da-da-da. So he left. But while he was there, he had been making some short films for Sesame Street.
Yes,
one of them,
that's right.
Yeah, right.
Hey Arnold short. And I saw it and I was like, that's pretty good, Craig. And he's like, oh, thanks, man. And he went off. Well, so now the show continues. We continue working together, and Craig has gone off and done his shows. And while he's gone, he and I kind of became friends because we lived in the same neighborhood. And but I'm still working with Paul, and Paul and I start talking about what are we going to do after Rugrats? What are we going to do? And we start coming up with ideas and stuff. And we thought, God, it's going to be so hard because we're not animators. In the meantime, Craig was saying, I want to do something too. So we said, let's do something together. So Craig and Paul and I sat down and started working together. And then we said, let's get everybody together like a big crazy group. So we had Craig, me, Steve, Pete Gaffney, John Greenberg, and we all get in a room and we just think of lots of ideas, and we came up with tons and tons of stuff. And as Rugrats was starting to wrap up, we started taking out and we started going around and pitching these projects. And it wasn't going very well, to be honest, because I think 6 sweaty guys walking into a room wasn't the best way to pitch something.
One executive said it felt like a men's locker room, and that's not what
it felt like
wanted.
a men's locker room walked in here. And we were like, us, But anyway, so at some point, Mary Harrington, who was the head at that point of Nickelodeon's development, Paul called her up and said, can we just come in and talk to you and you just tell us what you're looking for? Because we're confused. And she said, sure. And so we came in to this big meeting, and she got lunch for us, and we had all this cheese and meat sitting out there. And we all started pitching our stuff, and we went through it. And the night before this meeting, Paul and Craig and I had been talking, and Paul said, you ought to bring that Hey Arnold tape that you made when you were on Rugrats. And Craig said, do you think that's okay if I show it? And he goes, oh, sure. So we come in, we have this big meeting, and then sort of at the end of the meeting, well, it turned out to be the end of the meeting. Maybe the meeting would have gone longer. Paul said, hey, why don't you show that tape, Craig? And Craig pops this tape in, and Mary looks at it, and she turns to all of us and says, can I just talk to Craig by himself for a minute? And she threw us out of the office. And Craig came out of the office a little later, and he said, I think she wants to make the show. And Paul said, oh, you're going to make the show, Craig. She just bought your show. You just don't know. He goes, you think so? And he goes, yeah. So then Craig goes off and he starts developing this show. And I think because when he left Rugrats, he hadn't seen the team we put together, like that Paul and I and Steve and Pete and John and Rachel and Holly and all these guys and Mike Ferris had put together. He hadn't seen that. So he didn't know how that worked. He was still thinking of it as like a freelancey kind of thing. And he and I had become friends because we lived in the same neighborhood anyway. So he came to me and Steve and said, "Would you do this with me?" And we were kind of, "Well, what about everybody else?" And he goes, "I can't do it with everybody. I have to focus. I have to have just you guys. You guys are my guys." So Steve and Craig and I, which I think hurt a lot of people's feelings, to be honest with you. I think a lot of people, I think like John and Paul, probably Craig, I mean, probably Paul and Mike and Pete felt kind of cut out. But I think that's what Craig needed. And so we just sat down and we worked out the show because at that point, Craig didn't really have it all worked out. He had these characters, but really Arnold never spoke in the cartoons, in the comics that he'd done at the time. It was all in his imagination. And he really wanted to do this imagination thing, what's in Arnold's imagination. But he had also done these comic strips for Matt Groening, because Matt Groening was his brother-in-law. And so he had done these comic strips for Matt's Simpsons cartoon, comic book. And they were kind of more like what Steve and I were thinking, which is more like the next stage after, if Rugrats is about like preschool, let's say, like what's it like to be in elementary school is what we were thinking when we saw it. So we started developing that. And then Craig and Steve, more than me, really wanted to do something about girls having crushes, the early days of love, And so Craig had Helga in the comic strip, but she was just a mean girl. She was just like an older version of Angelica. He hadn't really moved on in his thinking of like, she was just a bully. And
Right.
anyway, and so we were working on it, and I kept saying, "Well, I get Angelica, she's a bully because she's a bully, whatever, but it's kind of primal." And I kept saying, "Why is she bullying him? We got to figure out these characters more." And Craig's wife doesn't remember this now, but how I remember it, we were all sitting around, and Steve and I, like Paul, Steve and I had been working since we were 20 years old, 21 years old together, right? So at this point, we've been working together now for 15 years or something. No, I guess I was probably about 33 or something when this happened. So we'd been working together a long time. We had almost like a mental connection, the same kind of thing Paul and I have, I think. And so his wife walked through the room and I was saying, "Why is Helga doing this? I don't get why Helga's doing this." And she said, "Maybe because," and his wife just said, "Maybe it's because she's in love with him." And she walked out of the room. And Steve and I just looked at each other and went, "That's the show. That's a different show than Rugrats," because we didn't want to repeat ourselves. We didn't want to just make them older.
Right.
We wanted something new. And
Right.
Steve,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and Steve, I think I told you, Steve was the guy who really latched on to Angelica as a character more than I think more than
Yeah.
all of us, even though we all followed his lead. We loved who Angelica was.
Right.
I think Steve and Craig really focused on that. I kept focusing on, and I continued to all the way through, like, okay, but it's called Hey Arnold. Like, who's Arnold? So I was always trying to so there's a lot of episodes, like, for example, like Eugene's bike and stuff like that in the turtle episode, at the beginning, things like that are more about like Arnold. But Steve especially really wanted to push the relationship stuff. And now also, the other thing that happened is if you think of it as a continuation of Rugrats, in some ways, I think of it as that way, they couldn't speak to the adults. Well, now they can speak to the adults. And the adults are kind of more messed up than the kids, if you think about it in Hey Arnold. And so all the relationships with the adults, Steve especially, and Craig, I think Craig got into that too. I kept trying to keep, I think the episodes that I was doing at the beginning, and I was only on for about the first 20 or 30 episodes, I kept holding us back, I think, holding us back down to keep Arnold a kid, which he kind of does, I think, throughout. But I think where Steve and Craig were really interested is Steve wanted to say, "I want to see it from Angelica's point of view, and I wanted to get into her life and her family." And Craig, I think, got really excited about the other adults. Steve too, so you have like, the famous Christmas episode of that one, which is really a Steve trying to put two or three ideas together episode. And, so that's what Arnold was. It was just different. It was a different thing. And eventually I think it was like kind of three kids in a playground. Like if you take three kids and you put them in a playpen and say, here's one toy or something, there's going to be a fight eventually. So Steve and Craig and I started going in different directions. And around this time, Paul came to me maybe about, I don't know, 9 months in or a year into working on that show. Paul came to me and said, hey, let's go work on something else because Disney wants me to come and do something. And that's when we went over to do Arnold. But listen, Hey Arnold, I mean, when we did Recess, but Hey Arnold I think was a great show. And I look back at those scripts we wrote, it was very difficult. It was a very hard show for me. And I think for everybody involved, because it was like because everybody was kind of pulling off into different directions. And we were able to get it together, but some of the writing on that show, it just let us be more sophisticated, than we had before. So I think of things like, like I always talk about the one that Steve, the one for me, because Steve has died now. I mean, he died a few years ago. And I think because we were all such good friends, I remember those scripts as like his most, his expression of who he was most or what he wanted to do most. So for example, like the one where, oh, by the way, I don't know if you know that, but the character of Oscar and Susie are supposed to be Gábor and Arlene, so that was so there's an episode where Oscar stays with in his room with Arnold. I don't know if you remember that one, but that's a great expression of Steve, and he's trying to get rid of these adults out of his life and has to make them fall in love with each other again. And it's all his attempts to do that. That's a good example. Or say, for example, like Stoop Kid is a Steve Vickstrom kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're just a little bit more. They're just a little bit more sophisticated, and I think that's where Steve wanted to go. And then eventually, after I left, it became more about like things like the country music star and what's going on with Helga's dad, the Pataki's beeper company and stuff like that. And that's not the stuff I was as interested in, So that's why I kept wanting to go back towards what's going on in a kid's world. So that eventually became Recess with Paul. Right? Would you say that's about right, Paul? Yeah.
You better.
But there are episodes I wrote on there that I go, well, this is as good as my writing ever got. There's tons of them. I mean, I think I just found one the other day that somebody was saying, do you have any old Hey Arnold scripts? And I found this one, which wasn't even a great script. I mean, it wasn't even a great episode with the Torvald. Do you remember Torvald episode? The character, Arnold has to help the class, thug pass math. Basically, that was
Okay.
and I was reading it going, this is a great script. At one point, he goes over, the kid is an awful kid, and he goes to the kid's house, and you only hear the mother. She just calls down from the upstairs, and he goes up, and the kid is horrible. He has a knife, and he's throwing it at the wall, and his a picture of his teeth, and it's like you go, oh my God, this is a horrible child. And then Arnold gets upset with him and he leaves. And as he's leaving, he passes the kitchen and there's a picture on the refrigerator that the kid had drawn in preschool or something. And it says, I love, and it says C- or something. the preschool teacher had put a grade on it. It's not even a very good drawing. And it said, mom or something. I love mom or something like that. And Arnold goes, and he goes back up and helps him because, anyway, and I was reading it. It's not, I don't think it's a very famous episode of Arnold or anything, but I go, God, we really hit some good stuff in there. But yeah. And like Eugene's bike is probably one of my favorite episodes. And I think that was kind of the last thing Steve and I really did together. Like maybe that's why I remember as a partnership, as a team. I don't know if you guys know that one where his bike breaks and he has to keep going back. And
yeah.
Okay.
That has a funny story is that we did a montage in the middle, which was again based on an old movie called To Sir with Love, where it's all like with this To Sir with Love, and it's all frozen images, like that as they're running through life. And at one point, Eugene eats a hot dog in the park, and then you see him choking in the next scene. And then the next scene, you see Arnold giving him a Heimlich maneuver, and then you see the hot dog shooting out of his mouth. And then it hits a sign, and it rebounds, and then it hits Eugene in the eye. So the next scene is him with an eye patch. And it was I thought that was so funny. Anyway, like later in this, and Nickelodeon was always trying to cut this stuff out. We were arguing with them, and they had a few months later, Craig read some article or something. He brought it into a meeting because he was in the middle of an argument with Mary, and some kid had saved his brother with a Heimlich maneuver, and they said, "Where did you learn that?" And he goes, "I saw it on Hey Arnold." And we were like, "Yes, you guys, we're right." We
That's
used
hilarious.
that as our reason. Any note anything we said, we were like, "Oh, remember the Eugene's bike episode?" Anyway.
Oh, man.
So
Yeah.
that's Hey Arnold for me. It was a great experience and a bad experience at the same time.
Gotcha.
Gotcha. So now moving on from Hey Arnold, of course, we got to talk about Recess. So I know you touched a little bit on how Recess was created, but what was that like? Was that the first show that you two created to like actually created together?
Yeah.
For sure.
Wow.
We had done some
That's
other
great.
things in development that we had gotten going. That we actually had even sold one called Mighty Girl, but we just couldn't get them going. And then these guys, the Disney people, a guy named Jay Facudo and
Barry
a
Blumberg.
couple of other people, Barry Blumberg and Natasha Khan, called Paul in and said, we want to do a show and at Disney. And Paul was never a big fan of Disney because, again, he liked the old Klasky Chupo kind of gritty style stuff. And so he was like, Disney? I don't want to work there. Right, Paul?
Right. What we found out, I was convinced that what Disney would want us to do was kind of do a soft kind of show, like Rescue Rangers or something like
Yeah,
that.
DuckTales,
And
like one of yeah.
Right.
right,
Okay.
that's
Those
what they were
shows. Right.
doing in the early 90s when we were doing Rugrats. And I thought they were just going to continue doing that. And so they invited me to come in and we talked and I said, look, they said, no, our company is changing and you can do whatever you want. I said, look, honestly, I don't believe it. I just don't think you'll really let me do it. When push comes to shove, I think you'll want me to take Disney characters and put them in an airplane or something. I don't want to do that. And so what happened was they called us into another meeting, and this was just me initially. And then I said, I want my partner Joe to come in, and they said, great, that's perfect. And we met them at the very beginning of 1996, I think it was. And we come into this meeting on a Monday morning, and these two executives have these like Cheshire Cat smiles on their faces. And they said, Paul, Joe, good to meet you, Joe. He said, did you guys hear what just happened? And we said, no, we don't know what you're talking about, because it was like 9 a.m. or something. And they said, well, it just got announced, and we just found this out ourselves, that Disney has purchased the ABC network. And because we purchased the ABC television network, we have to program Saturday morning. And that means we cannot do all Disney traditional characters. We have to branch out and do other stuff. And that's why you can do what you really want here. And Joe and I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. We ended up making the deal to develop an original show, and we had it in our contract that they could not ask us to do any shows with original with Disney design characters. It had to be our stuff. It had to be new and original. So we felt pretty good. And Joe said, you know what I want to do? I want to do what I feel like Arnold should have been, right? I want to do a show about what it's really like to be an elementary school kid. Not, when we're in elementary school, your attitude toward the opposite sex is ew, ew. You're not having crushes yet. That's junior high. That's, middle school.
Yeah,
So
like when you're 13 is when you're like going romance, that's the early
Yes, right.
romance.
So these kids are they're like 9 or 10. What are they?
Yeah.
So Joe said, and I said, that's really cool. So he said, let's do a show about what it's really like to be in elementary school. And so the first thing we did is we sat down and we said, what is it like to be in elementary school? What does that mean? And we said, well, if Rugrats is about how you're afraid, how you're excited, you're a baby and you're looking at the world and it's all exciting and new and everything's an adventure.
Right.
Elementary school is, now you're older, now you get an idea what the world is like, and it's scary out there.
Well, they've sent you to this place they sent you to this place. Your parents sent you to this place that seemed like a prison. Like you were free a minute ago. And then all of a sudden you have to sit there with these other kids who you don't know, right? I mean, it's like you go, and so we thought, like, what if we do it like a prison movie or something, you know? Which
So
the
we
first episode
initially
is.
based
And
our
but we
idea on
had
The Great Escape.
yeah,
I
but
don't know if you
the
guys-
idea is what you do, how you survive that is you start making friends with the other kids in the school. And like I think both Paul and I have friends. Paul and I, because we moved around a lot, have friends that we made in those early days in school who we have carried on. Like I still have friends from, first grade, kindergarten, Paul has friends that he still has friends from like high school and junior high that he knew. He married one of his high school friends, so it's like we really ended up like hanging on to those early friendships. And then there was a book that came out that kind of said this, that as much as anything that's important about childhood development is what kind of friends you make. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So we kind of ran with that as an idea. Abe?
Right. So that was our pitch about Recess initially. But really the hard work of Recess is we kind of came to this conclusion that what this show would be, and this was sort of something we sort of kind of lifted from Rugrats, is there'd be a core group of kids that were friends. And then there'd be all the other kids from school. And the core group would be kind of realistic, right? So
Yes.
there'd be 5 kids who were kind of the center of this world, and they were really close friends. And then as you got farther and farther out, the kids got stranger and stranger and more fantastical, more surreal,
So it allowed us to be,
or like
we called it, there was I don't know if you guys have ever heard of magical realism, but there was a famous author from Colombia, or I can't remember where, it's from South America, named Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who had
Gabriel
written these,
Garcia Marquez.
yeah, so where he'd written these books where like things would happen, you go, that can't happen. Somebody can't live for 150 years. That guy's dog cannot talk, whatever it is, something weird would happen. But we thought, in this world, what if the core is, like Paul said, very realistic? A little bit farther out, you get a little weirder, like the girl who thinks she can swing over the top of the swing set, and the kids who keep digging. And then the weirder and weirder, we're to the point where, aliens could come down or something, or like, anything could happen, like the weirdness of the outside, the periphery of those kids. And that just allowed us for tons of stories, and then we played, the rest of the adults were played as like prison guards. It's kind of how we were taking it, right? I mean, that's kind of where we started anyway.
Right. So it was all we
Yeah.
were doing Hogan's Heroes and Stalling 19 and stuff like that. We were so it was a way of looking at elementary school. And then it grew from there. I mean, actually, by the time we got into writing the show, as we got more into it, we said, okay, Principal Prickly and Miss Finster are kind of awful, but what are they really like? Why are they this way? And
Well,
then
we
you
started
get to
doing what we
love
did
them
on
too.
Rugrats, which is let's
Right.
go underneath them a little bit. Let's find out
Yeah.
who they are. Like some of my favorite episodes were ones like where, like it was the same thing. It's like, what's something that you remember that like and again, it was like everybody kind of remembers this, where you went to the store with your parents and there's your teacher there and you go, oh my God, my teacher buys milk, or whatever. Like, it's like, look at her. She's outside of that's my teacher, And we thought, okay, so we did that. And then that grew into, what if Spinelli, who hates Miss Finster more than anybody, has to be babysat by her for a week, And so it was like this connection between these two characters. And those are some of my favorite episodes where you start to take,
Oh, yeah.
you dig underneath, And I think it's the same, it all came from Rugrats from us. And I think in our way of thinking, and goes through, the line goes through, and a lot of the same, we're talking about ourselves, but a lot of the same writers worked on all 3 shows, Rachel Lipman worked on all 3 shows. Holly Huckins worked on all 3 shows. Mike Ferris worked on all 3 shows. John Greenberg worked on. Peter Gaffney, all these guys and all these people. And we kept bringing these people back in because they were funny, but also we had kind of together come up with sort of a theory of how to tell stories about childhood, I would say, that we all kind of
Absolutely.
agree.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
And then,
of course.
and then I think that was kind of, in a way, weirdly the end of it for that kind of style, because other shows like SpongeBob and
Yeah.
Powerpuff Girls kind of just took over
It's
from us,
interesting
you know.
because Recess aired between 19 I think it started in 97. I think
Might be.
so.
It
And it
aired the
ended
first
like
time the
about
day that Princess Diana died. That's how I remember when
right.
it started.
That's right.
Yeah,
So,
97, yeah. Uh-huh.
so then we went through like 2001, 2002, and after that, really animation had changed. It wasn't the way it had been in
Yeah.
the 90s.
TV,
Yeah.
kids TV animation no longer was this kind of Simpson style script driven animation. It just wasn't going to be that way. Ironically, or not ironically, interestingly, it has remained the style in adult television. So you have things like Archer and Bob's Burgers and things like that that have
Mhm.
continued on, in that style. But in in kids, it really took a left turn, and only recently do I feel like there's a few kids shows where they've tried to do it again. But even that, I mean, in the streaming era, I don't know where that's going either. It seems it seems like that era is kind of over right now, anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
Um,
know about you guys. I mean, as viewers, how did you guys first engage with this stuff? Was it
well,
Disney Channel? Or-
Like,
pro definitely Disney Channel for me. So I was so
yeah.
Recess I actually watched a lot, and I actually recently binge watched the show on Disney Plus. So that
yeah,
was
Disney
great
Plus.
getting to revisit the show.
Yeah.
And the movie I rewatched
Mm.
that as well, which was cool. And
Um,
yeah, but really,
yeah.
I was just gonna quickly say Disney Channel was kind of like the big thing for me. I mean, other things like Nickelodeon, a little bit of
Yeah.
Cartoon Network, but Disney was kind of my main
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. And for me, really, I really, me from my experience, of course, because to me, I was born in 2004, so it was kind of like those shows were kind of like like before my time. But of course, I do have heard of those shows definitely because how growth the show was, 90s, early 2000s and all. But but for what people say, what I've heard about, I've heard it was a wonderful shows that they got to be on, throughout those
Yeah.
stations.
I'll tell you an interesting thing about the movie is that I think both of us have mixed feelings about the movie. We liked doing it and we were proud of it when it was all done, but we didn't really want to do it originally because our concept of the TV show, which I still think holds, was that it's like all the little things that everything seems so big on the playground at school. Every little emotion is cranked up, like anything that happens, somebody steals your marble and it's like, what? It might as well be, you treat it like it's, that you'd have a trial over that, like somebody stole a marble. And to do a movie, we had to think big, and it became an opposite kind of situation. I mean, I think we were pretty proud of what we kind of came to, but it kind of was taking the idea and almost turning it inside out, which
Right.
kind of
Instead of
yeah,
taking little things and making them big, what we did in the movie was we took a big thing and tried to make it little.
I think it
Mm-hmm.
works, but I don't think it's. I liked I for me personally, I just felt like the TV show was more of a pure vision of what we were trying to do, I don't know. I don't mean to diss the movie, Paul, because I mean I do think it turned out pretty good. But and I feel the same thing about the Rugrats movies, to be honest with you.
Oh
Like I
yeah,
watched
I love those movies. Yeah, they're
they're great
great.
movies, but I always feel like the purity of that original idea of little babies who go, who wander around on their, who just want to go across
Yeah,
a
exactly.
yard is gone, like it's not like I'm going across a yard. Now I'm going to Paris. You know what I mean? It's like it
Uh,
makes it bigger. Do you know what I mean? And
yeah.
they're I'm not dissing the movies. I just think there was like a purity of a vision that I kind of miss from those early things. And the same with Hey
Right.
Arnold,
Hmm.
the Hey
Right.
Arnold movies. It's like I know what Craig was trying to do with that last movie, for example, and I admire the attempt, but I kind of feel like the stuff I liked was like, Helga building a thing in her closet, or
Hmm.
Eugene's bike, or trying to get the turtle, to free the turtle or whatever. Stuff like that is what I liked. But that's, it's a taste thing, and it's also like the difference between TV and the feature world landscape. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
from television, where it's just the usual 30-minute kind of like a
Yeah.
format, but then with the whole feature films, you have more opportunities. Okay, all right, let's expand this. So all right, let's think about more ideas we can add for
How do
this
we bring it
certain
to how do we
projects.
bring it from the small screen to the big screen, basically?
Yeah.
For
And
a
also things
longer
like,
duration to have some
yeah,
opportunities to do something like that.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
And it becomes more of a visual thing too. Whereas I think with TV, traditionally the voices carried things, and so you could get away with like poorer images, let's say, but if you had really funny actors and really funny story, and you could pull it off. Like
Right.
I think of
Yeah.
yeah,
the dog in the barbecue, I always think of, going, like that's not a scary dog. You know what I'm talking about, Paul. Like Paul
yeah,
would this footage would come back. This is from another time, you guys. I mean, the footage they would send the film. It was all done on film, like those original Rugrats. They'd send the film off to Korea, or the guys. They'd send the boards and everything off to Korea. The Korean crew would animate this film, and then a guy would go to the airport in Los Angeles and wait and get the film, and like the show's going to air on Saturday morning. This would be Wednesday or something, or I don't know when it was. They'd bring it back. Paul and the editor would frantically edit it, and there would be tons of animation that wouldn't quite work. And so Paul would do things like cut every other frame out of a scene or something, to make it move faster, or slow it down, freeze things, double print things. And it's like, wow. And somehow it would go out on Saturday morning. And often they would continue editing it so that a final version, which is the one you guys see, right? Or retakes would go
Yes.
back.
Yep.
So
yeah.
it was a crazy system. So it's kind of a miracle that, so there's things that I look at it and I go, well, that never really looked that great, but the voices were great, and that music is fantastic, and the story works. And ultimately,
Yeah, the storyline's great. Yeah.
I don't really care that the dog runs dumb, doesn't look good. I get that it's supposed to be scary, and I really feel for those two little babies trying to get back home. That's just an example.
Right.
Right.
When
Uh-huh.
you do a movie, they spend a lot of time on that pee shooting up in the fountain of pee, and that they can spend all
Yeah.
this time doing that, and you go, yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's cool, that's funny, and it looks great, but you kind of, to me, I want that emotional through line still, and I want it to be funny. So there's a different, you're going for the funny is the pee and how it looks versus the funny is
Hmm.
the, you know what I mean? It's just different. It's
Right.
different. The
Right.
features
Yeah.
have to look good.
Yeah.
TV, at least before before streaming, TV was about stories and characters. It wasn't
Right. Uh-huh.
about visuals. That's sort of changed now because there's a lot more money.
Yeah.
People don't go to
Yeah.
movies anymore, so TV's kind of taken over both parts. But
Whole
that's
streaming and
changed
all
over
this
the
other
last
stuff.
20 years or so.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just the industry of that part now is so changed, how it was, how and also because and the humor with various shows, and you can't, if it's still running now, like Simpsons or something like that, for example, I mean, of course they can probably still kind of keep that, but not as much as how it was, but like kind of like how SpongeBob was, early seasons to like now,
Hmm.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and with
'Cause I mean, I
reset.
look at things
Oh, go
like,
ahead.
yeah, sorry. I just look at like I look at storytelling, like, say, for example, um, oh, what's his name? Rick and Morty or something like that. And I go,
Right.
those are
Okay.
incredible stories. Like really amazing that he pulls that off every week. Or like even like there's a lot of stuff that I just go, wow, that's really interesting storytelling. That's different. But it's hard to imagine that as a movie. Do you know what I mean? It's like I don't know. I mean, what would you, I mean, you could do a movie like a Rick and Morty movie, for example. They probably have, I don't know. but
Or they
it
will
just
if they
it
haven't.
seems like it's going to lose something if you don't have that half-hour reset every time. That's part of what's wild about it.
Yeah.
And I think like there's certain things that were, just as an example, that's just it was designed that way. And I sort of feel like Rugrats and Recess and Hey Arnold were designed to be little short stories about a little tiny world in which
Yeah.
small little things are blown up emotionally by the characters into major dramas. And like I think about like for example, like we were talking about like one of our favorite episodes from Recess, for example, is called The Kiss. And going back to what Paul was saying about wanting to do something that's not about having crushes, but that where the kids all decide someday we're going to want to kiss each other, and they go,
And that's
"What?
the
That
most
can't be
horrible thought
true.
you can have.
That's
It's
so
like a horror
crazy."
movie.
And so we play it up. All that's going to happen in this show is that two characters have agreed they're going to kiss each other and report to the others on what it's going to be. That's the entire thing. And we treat it with a major we treat it like it's the biggest thing ever with music and confetti and everybody in the playground shows up and it's just like this big thing. And I think if you did that in a movie, it would just not play as well. Do you know what I mean? It has to be like you kind of got to get it out of it now. Do you know what I'm saying, Paul? Is that
Yeah,
making
it
sense?
has to be small. It has to be.
Yeah,
It's the small screen. It's a small world. Everything's small.
yeah. And then when you go to a big screen, I don't know. It seems like you just have to play it differently, and you have to take. I think about the Simpsons movie where they're going to destroy Springfield, and they have to, all that stuff.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of like, yeah, yeah. But I kind of just want to get back to the jokes about,
Right. Exactly. So another show for Disney that you both created was the short-lived show Lloyd in Space. How did that show come together?
They wanted us to do another show after Recess, and we had I had one. Remember, I told you, wait, if you go way back in the story, I told you about pitching those shows initially to Nickelodeon.
Yes.
That they said, no, 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 no.
Hmm.
Well, one of them that I always loved was a show about, it was sort of based on,
Griffith.
like it's supposed to be a kid who's stuck in a small town. Only in this case, and he's bored. And it was going to be the next stage after, okay, so Rugrats is preschool, Recess is elementary school. We wanted to do the next stage, which was middle school or junior high for us. And so we said, okay, you got a kid who's living in a small town and he's disgruntled and he's bored, except the small town is a space station and the kid's an alien. That was the idea of Lloyd in Space. It was just like, it's not, there's a space station, but it's not like the space station in 2001 that's so cool. It's like a broken down, it's like Button Willow, like I don't know if you guys are from California, but it's like in the nowhere in the middle of the desert, except the desert space. So Joe and I kind of took it and we sort of ran with that. And I really enjoyed what we did, but Disney was changing, everything was changing. At this point, it's like 2001, 2002, the world's really changing. And I think the show kind of felt like it was from another era. It felt like it was past its prime.
I mean, I think that the show, we had a great crew on it and it looked great, I thought. For considering we had learned a lot of our mistakes from making shows in the past, we had solved them, so the boards all came out great and, everything seemed great on it. We loved the cast. We loved the idea. We had a single mom, we were doing lots of things that were interesting. And there are episodes that I think are as good as anything we ever did. It's just that, like exactly what Paul said, it felt old fashioned already. Something had changed in the world. And I think the audience just didn't connect with it the same way. Or maybe they did. I mean, a lot of people tell us that they loved that show. It's just that it kind of, SpongeBob was happening and, Foster's Home for Imaginary Kids was happening. Adventure Time's
Yeah,
going to
yeah,
happen
yeah.
pretty soon. Things were
Imaginary
happening.
Friends, yeah.
Yeah.
So things were
Yeah, those
changing very
shows, yeah, of course.
quickly. And people were not as interested in stories that were kind of grounded in what it was to be a kid anymore. They wanted to go on adventures. I think that's what it felt like, or they wanted to go on they want, I don't know what people wanted. They didn't want that at that point anymore, it seemed like. I don't know if that's right. Would you agree with that, Paul?
Yeah, I think it was sort of out of time, you know, and
Yeah.
we loved it, and there were things about it that really were great, both I think this is true for you too, Joe, that Recess and Lloyd in Space were what we wanted them to be. They were our vision. People at Disney didn't tell us what to do. We got to do them our way. In the case
Now,
of
I
Recess,
know one thing and I'd say in the end of Recess, when the movie was happening and much of Lloyd in Space, we kind of did hand off a lot to other people because we were trying to figure out, because, it's not like we couldn't tell the world was changing. We could tell. We were like, uh-oh, our
Yeah.
world is shifting. And we just couldn't figure out how to catch up. Like I see things like Archer, or I see things like Rick and Morty or whatever, and I look at newer things and I think that's where it was going, and we were just doing something else, and that's kind of what our taste was, and so the uh, the world moved on and we didn't catch up with it somehow. Is that right,
Mm,
Paul?
that's right.
right. Yeah.
Gotcha.
It's a
Gotcha.
fish going through your head, Paul, so it's hard for me to take you seriously when you say that.
Yeah.
Right.
So I kind of just want to ask, kind of answer this briefly. So of course you both got to develop the 2010 reboot of Pound Puppies. Which so
Right.
now can you kind of like talk about like what kind of like you both kind of drew you to the idea of imagining this classic franchise for a new
Well,
generation in general?
that was a strange experience for us because we sort of looked at it and we thought this is like this toy that we never had any, that's kind of after our generation, really. It's kind of kids that are 10 and 20 years younger than us played with those toys. We never had anything to do with them. We knew about it, and we
Hmm.
thought the original show was not our kind of thing. But they'd come to us and said, we want to do a reboot of this show. And this is not the first dog show that Joe and I did, animated dog show. We
No,
also
we
did
didn't.
a Beethoven cartoon show about 20 years before that. But anyway, they said they wanted us to come and do this. And did we have an idea about it? And Joe and I sat down and talked about it and said, well, the idea is that it's supposed to be a pound. Well, what's a pound like? Well, we thought,
Yeah.
okay, kind of going back to our original idea about Recess, we thought, well, what if it's like a prison? A pound is a prison if you think about it. So what if we kind of set it up like Hogan's Heroes, where there's like a mean, cowardly prison warden, in this case, the head dog catcher and his assistant, and then there are a bunch of these dogs. But what if they're like prisoners, but really they're controlling everything in the background. So it became, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Hogan's Heroes, but it's sort of the same setup. Where, right, Joe? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
and so we kind of did it like that, and we sort of had fun writing it. We had a wonderful cast, but the way the show was produced wasn't really the way we wanted it to be, and the look of it and the animation weren't really what we wanted. We were never really that. It was okay, Joe,
I
what do
mean,
you have
look,
to
I,
say?
I would say there's things about, again, same thing. I would say there are episodes of that show, like the one, I mean, that I kind of got forced to write, but I thought it would turned out really great. The one where the main dog,
I never
Lucky,
barked for my father.
I never, yeah, yeah, it was where the main dog, he, his dad comes back, and the dad is a total scoundrel, and he doesn't like his dad, and he feels like his dad abandoned them when they were young, and then this whole thing, anyway, and it was, I thought this is good writing, this is as good as it gets, and we actually won some awards for it and stuff, but it just never really, and I think a big part of the problem is when we started doing Rugrats, and this is going to sound like an insane thing to tell you, but the budgets were around $400,000, $500,000 for every half hour. And I remember at the time, there was a show called LA Law that was on the air. And they said, and the budget for it had hit $1 million. And there was a big thing, $1 million. This is the most expensive TV show ever. And I said to Paul, our budget to do animation is almost $1 million per half hour because these were 11 minutes. And no, it's half hour, but this was an hour show. And we were like, this is crazy. Well, what happened is because it's expensive to do animation in those days. It was massive number of crews, right? Massive number of people drawing. Computers came in, and little by little, budgets went down, 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 down. And by the time we got to Pound Puppies, which is what, 2010, something like that.
Yeah.
By that time, the budgets were like 1/4 of that or something. It was some incredibly small number. And in order to do that, they were using brand new animation techniques that didn't look good. It just didn't look good. It looked like paper cutouts moving around.
What
right,
they were
Paul?
doing is they were taking the software that was designed to do animation for the internet, like really cheap and fast animation. You know these programs. I can't think of what the names escape me right now, but they were like very, very flat, very cheap technology that worked for the internet for doing really fast cartoons. But now people were using them to do television animation, and it just didn't look good.
And we kept trying to push them, Paul especially kept trying to push them to get the animation better, and the companies didn't have the money. They weren't being paid the money. So because of that, they couldn't, and we crashed crews. It was bad. People were putting up all-nighters to give us what we wanted, and it never came out very, very good. And so we ended up with this incredible cast. I mean, Eric Betty White was in it. Emmett Walsh, who is one of the great character actors. Eric McCormick, who is amazing. Yvette Nicole Brown was in it. All these amazing people. It was like we would get them together and we go, oh my God, Rene Auberjonois, who was one of our favorite actors when we were young.
Well, I'll just continue where Joe left off. So we got these amazing recordings. If you just listen to the tracks without the animation, they sounded great, but when they animated to it, it just looked terrible. And it wasn't because the animators weren't up to the job. It was because the money wasn't being spent to do it right. And there was
so basically it kind of unproved the thing that we had believed since Rugrats, which was if our tracks were good, the show was going to be good. And it kind of proved that that's not always true. Wouldn't you say that's true?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so
you have to have at least a certain level of good animation to sell this, or even in TV, or it's not going to be sold. I mean, if you look at something like South Park, for example, we were looking at South Park and things like you can have crappy animation. It doesn't matter. Not true. South Park it has been designed to be what it is. Do you know what I mean? And you buy it. They still have great control over what they're doing. We didn't have any control. It was really
like the more I fought to gain control, the farther it got from me. I couldn't make it work. And finally,
and Paul, I would say, and I'm going to say this, and you tell me if you almost had a breakdown over it. I mean, you were really at the end.
It was insane. It was killing me. I can't do this anymore. It was
because
just, it wasn't.
And it was and everyone around Paul who was trying to give him what he wanted, they were just getting more and more, they were just getting burned out. It was really bad.
It couldn't be.
And so eventually we stepped away from the show. One of our favorite old writers, a guy named Bart Jeanette, took over, who we'd worked on since since Recess.
Well, since Recess.
Yeah, and he took over and he ran it to the end, which was great. He got, but it just wasn't gonna work, and then at the same time, the toy company, which had said at the beginning, do whatever you want, they really didn't want a show about a prison. They wanted a show about some puppies. They wanted a cute show.
Yeah.
They wanted to sell a toy.
They wanted a cute show with little puppies that they could sell, and we were like, what? We're doing because Paul especially and me, I would agree that we kind of were the anti-cute guys. We were the guys who wanted to going back to what we said about Rugrats, or even The Simpsons, to be gritty was the goal, not to be cute.
right. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. So before we start to wrap this up, what are the two of you working on now? Can you share anything you're working on now?
Well, I'm retired. I
Oh,
haven't
gotcha.
called to work in animation.
Gotcha.
Well, let me just say, Paul and I spent
All
the
good.
the years after that, one after another, trying to get stuff going. And again, the world just had moved on. And the last
Yeah.
thing really, really we worked on, well, there's one thing afterwards, but together was a Recess reboot, which we wrote a script
Right.
that everyone at Disney was like, "Oh my God, this is great. We're going to do this." And then the bottom fell out of everything back in 2023, I think it was. And a
Yeah.
lot of people aren't even working there anymore. I mean, it's really crashed. And we were in the middle of making the pilot when everything got pulled, and it wasn't anything from us. And so it's just one of those things. I
Right.
think Paul, I'm speaking for you now, Paul, but I feel like Paul kind of thought my life's too short. I want to enjoy the rest of my life. I don't want to be struggling with this. I unfortunately have never been able to stop. So I keep writing things and have a couple different projects going, but nothing that you guys would have heard of or anything. But
Gotcha. Gotcha.
I'm working
Gotcha.
with a kid's book writer here in New Zealand, and we're trying to get a movie made off of one of his books and stuff. But
Okay.
I don't, uh, you know, I'm not going to hold out any great hopes. I do the best I
Right.
can.
It's kind of see what happens from there.
Yeah,
Those type of
I don't
things.
stop. And Paul, I think eventually will want to come out again. But I think it was really difficult going through the last two things that Paul and I worked on. And I think Paul
Not
was like,
because of anything between us.
no,
We all do the same work we've always done and enjoying working together and enjoying the work and loving the project and trying to make it happen. But the industry kind of imploded. I'm sure you probably heard that there isn't that much going on in Los Angeles anymore. It's kind of dried up. And the
Right.
things are changing
Yeah.
and getting more instead of the model where people watch network TV or Nickelodeon even or the Disney Channel. That's all changing now, and everything's going to the internet. It's not really it's it's not really what we did, or what we know how to
Right.
do. And so maybe that'll change or we'll feel differently, but for now it just isn't what we're doing.
yeah, it's hard to even know where to put your stuff, what kind of stories people even watch, or
Yeah. It's just
it's
so
hard to
different
know.
now.
It's hard to know. And I think, it's going to be really up to your generation, really, to figure it out because you're the audience, so. But I see a lot of people doing things like for people's phones and stuff. And I just like, well, I'm not going to join that because that's just crazy to me. It's like, the way people are doing things. But it is it's sad to think for us that era is over because we still have a lot of creative juice in us, I would say. But that's why I can't stop doing it. But Paul's like, I'm going to go fishing as you got the fish sticking out of your heads. What's wrong, Paul?
I mean,
Are you
it makes sense why
are
you
you
said
on a
that.
fishing
It makes sense
expedition,
why you
Paul,
said
somewhere
that,
that you
Joe,
didn't tell
because
me?
of,
Yeah.
because the way it
I
has in the
think I
background.
think Paul's
That's
off like
what
it's
you
Jaws or something. Paul's gonna go get that fish out in the
like.
ocean. After this, he's getting on the ship. He's gonna go out there
300 went in, 5 came out.
Perfect,
yeah,
perfect background for that example.
Oh
yeah,
man.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll catch him for 3, but I'll find him and I'll kill him for 10. That's Paul. He's gonna go get Jaws. Go, Quint. Go, Quint.
Oh gosh.
Oh man. So
Not the beard for it. You're looking very fisherman-y now. I have to say.
It kind of works, right?
When you had the black beard, it didn't work so well, but the gray beard is really looking like you're gonna go get something here, man.
Hast
You,
thou seen the
I
white
call you
whale?
Paul Ahab Germain from now on.
Oh my gosh.
Oh man.
Oh, I love
There
it.
he goes.
So to really end this off, Jake, take us home with the last question.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Chris, to the usual acts to every single guest towards the end. So, of course, this podcast is called Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show. When you think of nostalgia, what do you both think of, or on words, how would you both define the word nostalgia? What does nostalgia mean to both of you, Paul and Joe?
Wow, that's a big one. What do you think, Joe?
Well, I mean, boy, I feel like nostalgia is something where you go back to your childhood memories. That's what it feels like, and and the things that meant something positive for you to you when you were young. And yeah, that's what it seems like to me. And I think for me, I feel like I was super lucky, and I bet you will feel that you were super lucky when you get older, but I felt like the period between, say, 1965 and 1977 was an incredible period in music, literature, movies, TV, and I just got to experience it all firsthand. I'm so lucky that I was still alive when the Beatles were making music, and and
Right.
even all the way to when Star Wars first came out. I remember all the stuff in between, and I remember it as if it was formative. I think that's what nostalgia is. It's like formative
Hmm.
stuff that you can. That's how it feels like to me. I don't know what you think, Paul.
Well, I think that, but I also think for me, there's like two periods I'm kind of nostalgic for. I'm nostalgic for that period that Joe was just talking about because I have all those same feelings, but also for the period starting about 1989 or so and going through the turn of the century where we got to where the world seemed like the Clinton era when everything seemed exciting and it was like go 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 make things, that was
Yeah.
the height of creativity for our generation, I think,
Yeah,
at least
that's
for
true.
us, and I
For
miss
us.
that
Right.
too.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Great word to end on.
Yes.
So,
Thank you both very much.
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, Paul and Joe, great getting to speak to you both. This was fun.
Good
Yeah,
seeing
it's a lot
you.
of fun.
Good seeing
Take
you
Yes.
both
care.
as
Good
well.
to meet you both.
All right.
Seeing you too.
See you
A lot
guys.
of
Bye.
fun.
Bye.
Bye,
Take care, you
Paulie.
both. See ya.
It's goodbye from us as well. We absolutely enjoyed our time speaking with Paul and Joe. Keep on the
Yes.
lookout for more wonderful interviews coming your way. And as always, what do we say, Jake?
Yes, exactly. Keep nostalgia alive. Take care, everyone. See you next time. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to another wonderful Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show episode. Be sure to follow Jake and the Happy Nostalgia team on social media, check out our website, and stream the show wherever you find your favorite podcasts. And as always, remember to keep nostalgia alive. Bye-bye.